Thank you, Crow. Thank you, everybody, for being timely. It's always hard to follow up a break, but I think we can handle it.
I'm well caffeinated.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the classic problem of the comic, as Crow mentioned, finding those projects that really support a lot of modern digital infrastructure, but aren't really well known or usually maintained by one person, and for some reason that person lives in Nebraska. But no, I'm kidding, they live everywhere. But yeah, we're excited to talk to you about that today. We spoke about this a little bit in June in Austin and have made some progress on what it takes to identify a set of projects or critical projects. And yeah, excited to speak with you all about that today. And so to start, yeah, as Crow mentioned, really one of the objectives of the work group is to identify a set of projects deemed critical. And what we've learned from multiple discussions, very insightful discussions with the working group and the community at large, is that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to have a de facto comprehensive list that applies to every single user, every single stack, every single person as critical. And so the best thing to do in a case like that is to have a representative sample. So to help kind of feed that representative sample, we have initiatives like Criticality Score through the working group, which has data on over 100,000 open source projects, many of which are likely on this part of this representative sample. The Harvard Census 2, which was a great study on using research and analyzing using software composition analysis and statistics, and has identified 10,000 open source projects, many of which, again, are likely on that representative sample list, and many other efforts too. But it has been a fun and difficult exercise, I must say. But I think another cool thing to note is that while a lot is going into identifying critical projects, actual funding has gone into improving and helping, actually helping these critical projects. So Project Alpha Omega, which I believe we're going to hear a lot more about next, which is supporting foundations that host a myriad of projects and has already resulted in some wins, as well as Open Source Technology Improvement Fund, which, thanks to some modest introductory funding from OpenSSF members, has done code audits for 3 of the top 5 critical Java libraries, and since we last spoke in June, has patched 25 critical or high severity CVEs proactively. So there's a lot to be done, but thankfully a lot is also being done. And we have great folks like Julia and the working group really just trying to hammer out this age-old question of what are the critical projects out there.
So let's rewind a little bit. You and I have talked about how hard it is to come up with this list, right? And you alluded to the fact that there's not going to be one list, which is interesting because, I work in open source programs offices, which oftentimes stewards open source for a company, both incoming and outgoing. And it is actually really difficult when somebody comes to you, oftentimes much more senior than you are, saying, so what's the list? Give me the list. I want to know, which are the projects that we need in order to not go down tomorrow?
Yes.
And that is a complicated question. So in your view, what are some of the reasons that we can't have one list to give to my exec who wants answers?
Yeah. I think one thing, especially when you really get down to it, is I think it's all kind of contextual, right? So what might be a critical project for me or my organization might not be critical for you and your organization. So I think a lot of it is very context-based, and it's going to be, and there's really no absolutes here, I would say. You can't absolutely say that, System D or many other projects out there are critical to every single person or user of open source. So I think that's really where the challenge lies, in that everyone's needs are different and their stacks are different. And while it might sound super easy to just say, hey, generate me a list, in practice, I think that becomes a lot more difficult to manifest.
And also, in terms of criticality, we can approach it from a numbers perspective, but you also have to look at the kind of badness score, which is not the same thing as like the severity of a vulnerability. It's the way that I think about it is the systems that oftentimes we don't think about, like insulin pumps or other medical devices or things that control the power grid, the stuff that like literally keeps the lights on, right?
Yeah.
And it is those things are hard to quantify. And capturing that in an algorithm it's subjective.
Absolutely, yeah. The qualitative versus quantitative question comes up quite a lot. And at the end of the day, I definitely think both are critical to solving this problem, because quantitative models can only go so far. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. Lots of times don't consider those edge cases or maybe emerging projects or emerging technologies that might not be a standard or very popular now, but 5 years from now could be replace the current kind of de facto standard. So and it's also a moving target, right? So that adds even more complexity to it. But I think one thing that really helps with that is, and I think where a lot of value of like our working group, for example, securing critical projects and OpenSSF and the open source community as a whole, is that curation, that discussion. Like for example, at Open Source Technology Improvement Fund at OSTIF, we have a very large advisory council, people that are just in the space that we can discuss with and can bring to us potentially those edge cases or have us consider those edge cases. And OpenSSF, I believe, is doing the same thing and having a very large network of people and experience that can kind of share this information and kind of curate this focus and hopefully help us have a much more representative sample, as we talked about.
Yeah, and bringing the qualitative into the conversation is so important, because people have domain expertise that isn't really captured anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of also goes back to this idea of community and bringing the community together to work on the problem. But when you're talking about qualitative data, that's also you're selecting who is a part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. So right now, this room, we are the choir, right? We're fairly like-minded, I hope, being in this room. And so we just need to make sure that we are thinking about who isn't part of the conversation right now, who should be.
Absolutely. Diversity is incredibly important, especially when it comes to solving complex problems. And I think it really doesn't get more complex than open source. So yes, I completely agree. And I do think that's why it's great to see so much movement into, let's consider everyone's opinion, let's let everyone have a voice, let's consider those voices that may not have been heard before or may be suppressed. So I couldn't agree more with you there.
Yeah, it's even about bringing folks that don't think that they work with open source software. Because there are a number of people who think that they do not work with open source software. They may not directly, but they sure do indirectly. And understanding that kind of psychology of computer programming, which is a book that I read a long time ago, that is an important aspect of how we build this knowledge base of domain expertise that we bring into the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So, we said a lot of words there.
Lots of words.
Anybody have like questions? Or we've got one over there. I think we can repeat your question.
So I think what's interesting right now, we're looking at the criticality. I think what I'm worried about is that it's really over-biased towards thinking about inclusion criteria. And I'm really interested in what are the valuable exclusion criteria and what would it take for a project to be removed from the list?
Yeah, so the question was about criticality score is based on what data is included, and what are the exclusion criteria that would remove a project from that list. That's a great question.
It's a great question, yeah, and that's something we're hopefully looking into building out as we explore this problem, and that how do we kind of have some insight into projects. And I think, active maintainership, for example, I mean, that's a bit obvious, but maybe not considered all the time, that there could very well be very large projects out there that may not be as actively maintained as you would think or assume. And so assuming something like that, I think, would be a bad idea. So how I would say active maintainership, community, really the people behind the project, because I think sometimes we forget that at the end of the day, this is all powered by people, by human beings, and being able to represent that as accurately as possible is going to be really important. So that's what I would say. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a really thought-provoking question. And I would say that the consequence of removing a project that should not be removed is greater than the consequence of including them, if they shouldn't be there. So I think this goes back to one of the core problems, is that all of this is context dependent, and without being context aware, you can't necessarily formulate strict exclusion criteria, I would say. And then it depends what you want to do with that resulting list, because depending on your goals for it, the exclusion criteria change. But I would say that in general, if a project is maybe flagged as one that should not be on the list, that would be a manual review.
Yes.
Most likely.
Yes, and I think that's where the value of curation comes into play, where this is going to be a moving target. Things do change, technologies change, use cases change. So it's always going. I envision it being very much a living, breathing thing that is nimble enough to react to changes in the landscape, but kind of like we were talking about earlier, being nimble is important, but also really, how did we word that again? I can't remember.
I think it was like nimble but not reckless.
That's it. Yes. Yeah. Yes, because if if the result of our work is kind of to help, let's say, for resource allocation or to help organizations, to put a spotlight or think about projects, we really do want to think really hard about what we are putting out there, because while I do think, again, it's very context dependent, there are very much consequences to shining a spotlight or saying, we think these projects are critical. And one thing we've actually started moving towards is, at least for now, using the term set, because lists in themselves can be very problematic and can imply some kind of prioritization, or which is something we'd very much like to do. But right now, it's really just what is this set of projects that we should be focusing on or thinking more about. But another thing too, I'd say, is going back to potential exclusion criteria, is as more, I guess, consolidation around what best practices are or what folks should be doing, that I think should very much incorporate into how we prioritize or prioritize investment in projects, because you don't want to, you don't want to put a new roof on a house that has no foundation, So really thinking about this stuff is important, and I just want to give a shout out to the work group, for showing up at all the meetings and having great discussions, yes, as well as everyone who has volunteered their time, their insight, their experience. It's been really helpful.
Do you think we have time for
One
brief
brief
question? So we had, I saw a hand right there first, so.
Unfortunately, I don't think this will be brief.
Oh, well, we can take it outside later if you like.
Maybe it's simple. What do you tell what do you tell the fatalist that this is a chicken and egg problem? We are sitting in a chicken and egg problem. How do you convince them this is working?
So the question is, how do you convince the fatalists who think that this is a chicken and egg problem, that this investing in here is worth it? I will say that this is a conversation that I have with myself pretty much every day. So I think campground philosophy, we need to leave this ecosystem better than we found it, and that's what keeps me going.
Nice.
So
I think that's a beautiful way to conclude, yes.
okay. Well, we're before we get ushered off the stage, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah.